الصلاة والسلام عليك يا
Now today's presentation is by Robert Starry. He's a QC, and he's not just some random person we've picked out or the only person that's willing to do this. We're actually very fortunate that he's doing this for us today, and we hope that the number will be better than this. He's represented 4 different trials related to terror trials. One was the Jack Thomas case, one was regarding the Tamil Tigers, another one was the Penn Ennis trial and the Leeds trial. So he's very well versed, you would say?
Yes, thank you.
In constitution and laws regarding terror laws, ASIA laws, and all those other laws. So today he's here to explain to us what are our rights, and what are the government's rights, and what's everybody's rights, so that we don't transgress the boundaries and trespass against the boundaries on either side. Okay? Because we're law-abiding citizens, we're living according to Islam, and we're living in this country, so we need to know what are our rights so that we're not oppressed and we don't oppress. So please lend your ears to Robert Starry, and inshallah we'll benefit from his talk. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much. And first let me say it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for your kind invitation. I should say something about my own background so you know who I am. Firstly, my father is a post-war immigrant to this country. He was 5 years in a displaced persons camp after the Second World War and came here effectively as a political refugee. Non-English speaking person, was placed in a camp north of Albury called Bonegilla, where he was kept for 2 years and then had to work for a government organisation. At that point it was what was called the Postmaster General, or the equivalent of Telecom and Australia Post, for a period of 2 years before he was allowed to integrate into the community in 1951. He married my mother in 1954. She was a person from an English-Scottish background, and her parents basically disowned her because she had married someone who was a European Catholic. And in 1954, sectarianism unfortunately was rife in Australia, and I never really knew my grandfather because, as I said, my father was a person who came from a Catholic tradition. I then went to a Catholic secondary school in Yarraville in Footscray. I grew up in Footscray and the western suburbs. I actually grew up in a Ministry of Housing estate, and so I knew lots of my friends. Most of my friends came from non-English speaking migrant backgrounds. They were new settlers to Australia in the 1960s and 70s. But the one thing that the Christian brothers, who were our teachers, taught us was about the injustices that had been committed against Ireland, and talked about frequently the expulsion of foreign occupation, being the British troops from Ireland. Had they talked about that in 2005, they'd be arrested as anti-terrorists under the current anti-terrorism law. They would be regarded as people who are involved in an attempted destabilisation of a foreign sovereign government. That's the British in their control of Ireland. And it just goes to show you how things can change. If I took a view, for instance, to say that foreign troops should be expelled from Iraq because of their involvement in the false war, false pretext for a war in Iraq, and foreign troops should be expelled from Afghanistan, nobody would say anything against me. I'm a white European Catholic. And even though I hold those views possibly as strongly as some of you may, there's no possibility that there'd be any action taken against me. But if you're a person from the Middle East, if you're Lebanese, or if you're Egyptian or Algerian or Syrian or wherever you might be from, and you actively, publicly supported the expulsion of Australian and foreign troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, you may well be the subject firstly of an investigation, you may be the subject of an interrogation, and you may be charged. And what I'll do, I'll talk about some of those cases that we've been involved in, one of which Baha talked about, which is very current. That's the Operation Neath case, which, as you all know, is the case involving a number of Lebanese brothers and Somali brothers who have been charged for talking about how easy it might be to breach security at Holsworthy Army Barracks. So what one has to do is one has to look at counter-terrorism, and one has to look at it in the context of modern politics. And if you don't mind, I'll take a seat. Thank you. Thank you, Baha. So one has to look at it in the terms of modern politics. And one thing that I've always said, having been involved in issues involving people who express an alternative political or religious or cultural view, is that you must look at the current circumstances. And without wishing to offend anybody, it's clear that unless the conflict between Israel and Palestine is resolved, then conflict with the Islamic world will continue, because it's a central issue that justice for Palestinians must be achieved. And you don't need me to tell you, when there's a public debate about that issue in Australia or the West generally, it's a very dangerous thing to embark on any criticism of Israel and their actions in the Middle East in the repression and oppression of Palestinian people, and how they should be brought to account. As soon as you say that, as you know, you are branded as being an anti-Semite, and you're criticised relentlessly by the Israeli lobby. It's easier for me to do that because I'm a European Catholic, and if I say it, I'm not criticised. But if you're a person who professes the Muslim faith, or if you're from the Middle East and you say it, then you're much more likely to be criticised and attacked. So that's the sort of context in which the post 9/11 events have led to the establishment of what really is a wholesale attack on the community generally through the passing of these laws. We have spent, as you might know, $26 billion on counter-terrorism in Australia. We have passed 46 pieces of legislation under the Commonwealth Government eroding individual rights in favour of the state. And some of those rights that we've lost, not just in counter-terrorism, have been translated in other areas. For instance, the laws relating to ASIO, where you are obliged, where you have no right against self-incrimination, you have no right to silence, and where a hearing might be conducted in secrecy, those laws have been transferred into other areas of the law, including, for instance, the Australian Building and Construction Commission, where construction workers are effectively subject to counter-terrorism laws. And you might say, well, how is all of this possible? How have we allowed ourselves to get to this point? Once we arm in the intelligence community with the sort of powers that they have, they're not going to relinquish them. They're not going to give them back. I might use this example of my brother, who was in the management of a big shopping complex at Water Gardens in the west of Melbourne. Post 9/11, the owners of that complex, a big insurance company, became anxious about security issues. And my brother said that they received regular 3-monthly briefings from a person who was a former intelligence community officer, and kept coming to Water Gardens and saying to them immediately post 9/11, it's not a question of if a terrorist attack occurs in your shopping centre, it's a question of when. And what he saw, and he's not involved in the same way as me, and what we see is the shocking, disgraceful scaremongering that's been engaged in by those people in power. Because what it does, it reinforces power and it reinforces repression of various groups. It's no coincidence, I don't think, that when you look at the comments of David Irving, who's the Inspector General of ASIO, it's no coincidence that of the 20 organisations that have been declared as prohibited terrorist organisations, 19 of them are Islamist organisations. There are no other so-called terrorist organisations. Going back to my own history, there's not, for instance, the Irish Republican Army. There's no white supremacist group in America that's declared as a terrorist organisation, neo-Nazi organisations. There's no other organisations that might be a threat to the community that have been declared as terrorist organisations other than the 19 Islamist organisations. One other organisation that's been declared as a terrorist organisation is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, some of which may have members of the Muslim community, Sunni Muslims, but they are also declared a terrorist organisation. So this is what, I'm going to read this to you, this is what David Irving said on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. This is just 2 months ago. The head of ASIO, Australia's elite security agency, says the fact it has trebled in size since the September 11 attacks is certainly justified. ASIO Director General David Irvine said ASIO had to take on more resources to manage a unique terror threat in the wake of the attack on New York. He said that growth was certainly justified, but acknowledged there would always be debate about the size and the scope of ASIO. If you were to ask me, this is what he said, if you asked me what have been the most significant changes in ASIO in the last 10 years, I would say that dealing with the terrorist problem has required us to take on new resources for a start, use new techniques, use new technology, Mr. Irvine said in an interview with the ABC. Legislation has been adjusted to enable us to manage this at the time. Quite different phenomena, different to anything we faced in the past. Mr. Irvine related the threat to Australia from Islamic extremism at the same level it was a decade ago, but says ASIO has increasing concerns about lone wolf operators, such as the Norwegian mass murderer Anders Breivik. We do have a very small number of people in our midst whose intentions are not necessarily all that benign, he said. Mr. Irvine also warned against complacency following the death of Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. I don't think we can be complacent, and I don't think now, 10 years later, following the death of bin Laden, I don't think now is yet the time to relax our vigilance. His death does symbolise a further step in the weakening of the ability of Al-Qaeda from the Pakistan-Afghanistan area to control events, but the threat hasn't diminished because what we've seen is the Al-Qaeda ideology and objectives have been taken up by other groups. Now, I'm not an expert on intelligence and I'm not an expert on foreign affairs, but anybody who takes a view that Osama bin Laden was behind the revival or the assertion of Islam throughout the Middle East is deluding themselves if they think one person, Osama bin Laden, is the one person behind it. History has shown that organisations spontaneously bring about change in their own communities. Just have a look what's happened in Egypt. Have a look what's happened with the overthrow of Mubarak and his pro-US and pro-Israel stance in that area. Have a look at the destabilisation and the treatment of the Muslim Brotherhood over the last 50 years. If he thinks that's David Irvine or anyone else in the US or UK or Australia thinks that by the elimination of one person you can repress a movement, a mass movement, then I think, as I said, they are deluding themselves. And so what we will see happening now, in the wake of the Spring Revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and now in Syria, we are going to see some radical changes in the balance, I think, in Middle East politics. And so I go back to my original point. Until the conflict in Palestine is resolved by recognition of a Palestinian state, and that the attacks and the occupation of Palestinian lands are not ceased, then we're going to continue to have a problem, in my view. I say that coming from outside of the community, but I say that from my own assessment of those sorts of the sorts of events that have unfolded. If you've ever been to Canberra, you'll see the new building that's been constructed for ASIO. It's the largest building that's been constructed since the building of the new Parliament House. So they are going to have enormous resources. They will be employing, as David Irvine said, it's trebled in size since 9/11. So you can expect that you'll have much more contact with ASIO, I think, in the immediate future, whilst things in the Middle East particularly are as volatile as they appear to be at the moment. Once you give power to those sorts of organisations, those sorts of secretive organisations, as I said before, they are not going to relinquish that power. They are going to remain in control, and they use whatever techniques they think are necessary. Leaving aside the strict laws, they are going to use whatever techniques they think are necessary to maintain the status quo. In other words, whilst Australia has a partisan attitude towards Israel, that is, through Julia Gillard and her predecessors, they say that we go to that conflict with neutrality and with an even-handed approach. Well, that's simply not true. And every person who observes politics knows that the Australian government has a largely pro-Israel stance. So I can envisage that ASIO will continue to play an active role in trying to suppress people, firstly, who are pro-Palestinian in their actions and their words and deeds. And I can see that those people who are Palestinian or from the Middle East, Syrian, Lebanese, Jordanian or any of the other adjoining countries, once they agitate for justice and an even-handed approach in Palestine, then they're going to be the subject of considerable surveillance. So that's my little spiel about my assessment politically of why it is that we've got the laws that we have. The Israeli lobby is the most powerful lobby in the country. It's powerful politically, with people like Michael Danby in Parliament. It's powerful because of its allegiance to the United States, where the pro-Israel lobby is even more powerful, and it's powerful economically in terms of business. So they are going to continue to assert that Australia should continue to have a partisan approach in favour of Israel. Now, one thing that we've said in our negotiations and discussions with the people from the intelligence community and the Australian Federal Police and other organisations is that the $26 billion that has been spent on counter-terrorism, and you might ask for what purpose, if those intelligence and policing agencies had more engagement with the Islamic community to ensure that, firstly, when I talk about the Islamic community, obviously I'm talking about a very broad church of organisations, but to alienate, to ostracise, to isolate the Islamic community is nothing, has been nothing short of disastrous. It was a curious thing when we acted for Nasser Benbrika and the other brothers in the Pendennis trial. It was a curious thing that on the one hand the authorities were saying that we want to engage with the community, but on the other hand the treatment of those men, firstly, as you remember, by placing them in isolation, solitary confinement in very difficult circumstances that took a long time to change. Then with 4 of the brothers being acquitted, no apology, no compensation, no nothing, to have them prosecuted in that way, in my view, whatever you want to say about Nasser Benbrika, my view was a complete disaster. I don't know how deep the wounds are and how long they're going to take to heal, but from an outsider, again, from an outsider's perspective, I could only see damage being caused to the group that Nasser and the boys, the other men, belong to. I could only see further alienation occurring as a result of their treatment. So let me say something about some of the powers that ASIO have. And I'll talk about, I'm going to talk separately about, through some of the examples, about the way the Commonwealth criminal powers counter-terrorism can be so all-embracing. The net has been cast very widely in counter-terrorism, and there are things that you might do that you might have no idea amounts to an act of terrorism against Australian law. But under the ASIO Act, that agency have enormous powers. Firstly, under the Act, there is a power to compulsorily request people to attend for the purposes of interrogation. A warrant can be issued by the Attorney General, and we saw that happen in the Benbrika case, where people were compulsorily interrogated, and in that interrogation you have no right to silence, you have no right against self-incrimination, and you are not necessarily entitled to the lawyer of your choice. I'm not sure that what they think of me at the moment. If you ever wanted to utilise my services, but they can vet what lawyer you have. They need to have substantial grounds for that, which might include alerting other people who might be the subject of an investigation or the destruction of evidence that might be useful. So firstly, no, you have no right against self-incrimination, and you must answer questions, even if you've committed no wrongdoing, even if you are simply aware of certain things but and do nothing, you must still go and answer questions. Here's an example. If it was said, for instance, that money was being sent back to Somalia to support for humanitarian purposes, to support an area that was controlled by Al-Shabaab, that would be a terrorism offence under current Australian law. You are not permitted to fund an organisation directly or indirectly, even for humanitarian purposes. The police or the ASIO would be entitled to have a warrant issued. They would be entitled to compulsorily or cause you to compulsorily answer questions about the funding arrangements that you're aware of, who was involved, where the money was to be directed to. They would be able to ask you whether you travelled to Somalia. They would be able to ask you who you stayed with, and you would not be able to, under the law, resist to answer any of those questions. If you did, you would be the subject of prosecution, and you could receive up to 5 years imprisonment if you refused to answer questions. You could also be prosecuted if you answered questions that were false. So that if you gave false or misleading answers, you could be prosecuted. You could be prosecuted if you told anyone that you were part of an ASIO interrogation. At the time in 2005, when some of the brothers in Nasser Ben-Brika's case were dragged off the street, they could not tell their family where they were. They could not tell their employer where they were, because if they did, they'd commit another offence punishable by 2 years imprisonment, and they were not permitted to say anything about the nature of the interrogation. So you would be taken to ASIO headquarters, you'd be interrogated. You could not tell anyone within your family, you could not tell your employer, and you would, as I said, face the risk of prosecution. Even if you've done nothing wrong, face the risk of prosecution. So it became very apparent to ASIO agents that this is a pretty unsuccessful way to try and deal with people, because it was like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The best way to do it would be to do it informally. Someone from ASIO would approach you and say, look, I just want to have a cup of coffee and just talk to you. You've not done anything wrong. We're not intending to prosecute you. And we just want to have a general chat. Are we obliged to go along for a general chat? Well, you're not. Anything you say to any ASIO officer or Australian Federal Police officer will be recorded. You won't necessarily know you're being recorded, but it'll be recorded either by some taping mechanism, or the officers or the agents will take down notes of what's been said. So there is no such thing as an off-the-record chat. Absolutely no such thing. And we know that in the Jack Thomas case that ASIO was working complicitly with the Federal Police. ASIO says to you and to the community, our charter is not about prosecution. We're not a prosecuting agency. We're only here to compile intelligence. That's all we're interested in. But let me tell you categorically, that is not true. They use whatever intelligence that they get to assist in the prosecution of alleged offenders and suspects. No off-the-record chats. You're not obliged to say or do anything on an informal basis. You're only obliged to answer questions if a warrant's been issued and you've been taken into ASIO headquarters for that purpose. That's the only time you're obliged to answer questions. But at all times you are permitted to ask for the assistance of a lawyer. And you can do that through legal aid. You could do that through the Darebin Community Legal Centre, or you could do that through a firm like ours. You can ask for advice from a lawyer. You can ask for a lawyer to be present. So long as your lawyer doesn't get excluded for whatever reason, you can choose. ASIO have a right to issue warrants to enter your premises and to search. They have a right to remove computers, hard drives. They can remove virtually any document, and they can exercise that right in the same way that police can do in a normal, the commission of a normal crime. They can take anything that they believe assists them in compiling intelligence. What they do say to you, though, if you're formally interviewed, is that you have an indemnity. So you might say, I am aware that something's going to occur. I don't know where, I don't know when. I'm aware that people are gathering for a particular purpose, and you might say, and I'm involved in that. whatever you say to ASIO, the one safeguard you have is that it cannot be used against you for the purpose of prosecution. Whatever you say to the Australian Federal Police is different, of course, that can be used against you. But what you say to ASIO cannot be used against you in your own prosecution. So that's an important point. They can hold you for up to 7 days continuously, 168 hours they say in the Act, and it can be extended by breaks, and it can be extended if an interpreter is required. And you saw the debacle of the Dr. Hanif case in Brisbane, where shamefully they detained Dr. Hanif and made continuous applications for extension of time for the purpose of interrogating a man that had done nothing wrong. And his worst crime, of course, was to be associated through family, distantly, from people who were involved in the Glasgow bombing. So let me talk about a number of the cases that we've had. I think one of the most disgraceful prosecutions in this country has been the prosecution of Jack Thomas. He went to Afghanistan in its reconstruction after the expulsion of the Russians in 2001, along with a number of other people who you know, some of whom been named, Shane Kent, David Hicks and others, and it was not a crime to go to Afghanistan in that period. So he went there lawfully and legitimately. After 9/11 occurred, of course, there was something like 20,000 foreign nationals in Kandahar, and he escaped the carpet bombing of Afghanistan after 9/11 and went to the northwestern provinces of Pakistan, and he remained there for a period of time before arriving in Karachi in January of 2003. He was intercepted at the airport, and as you all know now, was kept in detention in Pakistan with US backing, military institutions for a period of 5 months. And then in June of 2003, not because of any support from the Australian government, only because of agitation from his family and members of his community and some people within the media, that we were able to get him to be brought back to Australia, despite the reluctance of the Australians, because we'd known what happened to David Hicks at that stage. We knew that he'd been a sacrificial lamb in being sent to, with Mamdouh Habib, been sent to Guantanamo Bay, and we wanted to avoid that happening to Jack Thomas. So in June 2003 he came back to Australia, and then in November 2004, as you all know, those of you who know him, having come back to his community, reuniting with his wife, having another child, working 3 jobs, buying a very modest home in Werribee, in a fanfare of publicity, he got arrested in November 2004. And in that fanfare of publicity, how was he described? He was described as Osama bin Laden's white boy in Australia, as the sleeper cell waiting to be activated. They thought that he was going to be activated within 6 months of his return to Australia. He did nothing. He continued to work. He continued to pray at the mosque at Werribee. He continued to look after his family. Did nothing. They said, well, that shows you how effective he is. He sat back and done nothing. They waited another 6 months. He did nothing further. And then he was arrested in November 2004. And of course, when he was arrested, we had the full theatre of his arrest. We had the helicopter hovering over the court. We had the dogs running through the courts. We had police in full gear with submachine guns and everything else outside the court. And we had really, in my view, and I'll be criticised for this, but in my view we had a completely hysterical response about his arrest. And of course he was put into detention in solitary confinement because they then said the crime that he'd committed, and let me say this to you, his real crime, his only crime, was his conversion to Islam. That was his crime. He was a white man who converted to Islam. Having done that, he was arrested. And I think the reason now, absolutely certain about this, the reason he was arrested was that the authorities wanted to send a message to the community. If you convert to Islam and you support Wahhabist military ideology, I don't want to say jihadist ideology because I know what jihad means, but to use the West term of jihadist ideology, then you will be punished. We will make you a sacrificial lamb and we will make an example of you to others. So he was arrested, put into solitary confinement, terrible circumstances, was denied permission to see his family and his children, and then finally the following February we were able to get him released on bail. He was then charged, as you probably know, with providing himself as a resource to a person either connected with or associated with Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda, and the support was being in Pakistan and receiving people who were sympathetic to the work of the Taliban, not Al-Qaeda. But that was enough to have him charged with that offence and receiving resources from a terrorist organisation, which was his passage back to Australia. Took 6 years before he was finally exonerated. We were successful in an appeal, and then again after the appeal, what happened was that he was charged as a result of a documentary that he participated in Four Corners, explaining why he went to Afghanistan and talking about his conversion to Islam. Shamefully, the authorities used that as a basis to re-prosecute him. And so what did we have? We had someone who was a convert to Islam, having gone to Afghanistan and was literally held out as an example to others that if you do any of this and you support the Taliban or any other organisation, you will be crushed. And it's had a terrible toll on him, as you all know. So what happened? Well, at about that time, Nasser Ben Brika and those people through his DARS classes got arrested because of for an offence of fostering or nurturing a terrorist attack. And you don't need to identify any specific terrorist attack. And you remember Abdullah Mehi was said to be the MCG suicide bomber. Absolutely laughable allegation. Front page of the Herald Sun. And how did he get charged with that offence? Well, because of telephone intercept material, they were able to show that when Abdullah was talking to Nasser, he was talking about what had occurred in Iraq and the killing of innocents, and said, if we kill 100,000 people in Iraq, are we able to kill 100,000 people here? And there was discussion about that. But that conversation, as meek as it was the basis on which he was charged with providing himself as a resource as a terrorist to a terrorist organisation. And the terrorist organisation was not them being members of Al-Qaeda or Taliban or any of the other Islamist organisations. They were their own unnamed and unspecified organisation. Their point of common interest was that they all went to Nasser Ben Brika's DARS classes. That was their point of common interest. And so Abdullah was acquitted of that charge because the jury could not see that there was anything remotely like an allegation that he had provided himself as a resource. But what those boys were convicted of was, of course, being members of the organisation. They paid a terrible price, the four men that were acquitted, Bassem Rad and the others, Shui Hamoud, the others who were acquitted, Hani Taha, paid a terrible price having been in custody for 3 years. And even though I think the authorities thought that the prosecution against some of those men were weak, they persisted with them because the purpose of the prosecution was not so much how much jail sentences might be imposed in the long term, but they were going to spend a long period on remand without any right of compensation, without any apology for the way they were treated. And then more recently we've had the episode of the Somali, it's described as the Somali case, but there are a number of other Lebanese boys, Naif al-Said and Wassim Fatal, as well as the Somali boys who were charged with conspiring to commit an act in preparation of a terrorist attack. There's never been a charge of that nature in the history of criminal prosecution in Australia. So it's conspiring to commit something in preparation of a terrorist act. So what did they do? They talked about how easy it was to breach security at the Holsworthy Army Barracks. And their conversations were recorded when Wassim Fatal was in jail, and they were recorded over the phone and said some stupid things over the phone, but it's because of what they said resulted in their conviction. And this Friday they are going to be sentenced in the Supreme Court. Two of the brothers were acquitted, but there are three others that have been found guilty, and they're going to be sentenced on Friday in the Supreme Court. Now, whatever happens, we're going to be appealing that decision because we think it's got to be more than a question of simply what you might say over the phone, where there are no concrete plans in place, where there's no purchase of weaponry, where there's no other specific action or plan, to simply talk in the way that they did, in our view, should not constitute an offence. So what's the point of all of that? Well, here's the first point. You need to be very careful about what you say and to whom. If you talk about conflict in Palestine or conflict in Somalia, if you talk about the expulsion of Ethiopian troops, or you talk about other wrongdoing, if you talk about isn't it great that Mubarak's been overthrown and that the Muslim Brotherhood will finally take power, you talk say any of those sorts of things, then you can expect your phone calls are going to be monitored. So that's the first thing. Be very cautious of what you say on the phone. The second very important lesson, it's a very important lesson, is to be wary of infiltrators, because none of these cases can succeed without the infiltration of what are called covert operatives. They are people from within ASIO and the Australian Federal Police who act as informers. We know that in Nasser Ben Brika's case there was a Turkish police officer that was used to infiltrate the group. We know that in all other cases there is a great reliance on people who act as infiltrators. So you need to be very cautious about what you might say. I'm not saying that you're going to do anything wrong, but you just need to be very cautious, because an increasing feature of all of these prosecutions is the use of informers, people who turn against their brothers, either from within the group or through, as I said, through infiltrators or covert operatives. And it's going to be an increasing feature with the way ASIO is constructed and the way they are now resourced. It happens in normal policing, so we see infiltration occurring in drug syndicates, and we see infiltration occurring in bikie gangs. We know that it's now a common feature of policing, but it's going to be a particularly potent and common feature within counter-terrorism cases. If you have views about what's happening in Indonesia, if you have views about what's happening in Somalia or Palestine or anywhere else, you need to be cautious about the way that you express those views. The laws are very widely cast. You can be a member of a terrorist organisation formally or informally. You don't have to, for instance, contribute to the Sanduk. You don't have to sign. You don't have to pledge allegiance. You don't have to sign up anything. You don't have to wear a military uniform. You can be a member of a terrorist organisation informally. And what happened for the Tamil community was that they were sending money back for humanitarian relief in the conflict in Sri Lanka. It's the Hindus and the Buddhists, really. But it's a cultural conflict and it's a geographical, territorial conflict. And whatever you might think of either of those religions, it was confined within the borders of Sri Lanka. And the Tamil community were sending money back to support hospitals and orphanages. The same way, for instance, Hamas might support various organisations within the Gaza. It became an offence to provide funding to an organisation, even though the Tamil Tigers were never a proscribed organisation. The government said, in the same way that they did with Nasser Ben Brika, they are a terrorist organisation because of what they think and what they do, or what they intend to do. And so 3 men who were representatives of the Tamil community were prosecuted for funding and providing support and being informal members of the Tamil Tigers because they supported their liberation struggle. After 3 years of litigation in the Supreme Court, the case collapsed because they could not prove that the Tamil Tigers were a terrorist organisation. They were involved in a civil war, and the authorities couldn't prove that these men were involved in any way with any act of terrorism. But what they were convicted of was providing funding to the Tamil Tigers under the United Nations Charter of Terrorism Act. And there are over 1,200 organisations that are listed. You know here in Australia that if you support Hamas, the political wing, that's not an offence. But if you support Hamas, the military wing, that is an offence. They're a proscribed organisation. But if you look at the United Nations Charter of the Financing of Terrorism, as I said, there are 1,200 organisations that have been identified, and you will not know if you're sending money back to Lebanon or to Somalia or wherever, whether any of those organisations are under the Charter of the Financing of Terrorism. You send, and we know this is happening within the Somali community, they are sending money back to support their families whilst there is very serious civil uprising and civil war with the Ethiopians occupying at least part of the country. They're sending money back to support their families and to provide humanitarian relief. But if the area is controlled by Al-Shabaab, then that's an offence. And the AFP might come to you, or the ASIO might come to you and might say, we're not interested in prosecuting people who provide financial support for their families or their local mosques or their orphanages or hospitals. That's what they said about the Tamils, and they were prosecuted. So you'll excuse me for being very cautious about the risk of prosecution. My view is that if you wish to send money to support your brothers and sisters back in those areas of conflict, it's much safer to do it either by sending money directly to your family or by sending money through one of the aid agencies like Red Cross. That is the much safer way to do it. Funnily enough, when I was at school, we sent money to an organisation called Green Aid for Ireland, and they supported families, families of IRA suspects that were in prison. We did that through our school. today would be prosecuted. Today we'd be involved in a criminal offence. If any of the events that took place now in Tunisia or Libya or Egypt took place in Australia, if you supported any, or Syria, any of those causes against repressive regimes, then you will be committing an offence against Australian law, because you are not permitted to support any organisation that's involved in the destabilisation of a sovereign government. And here's the best example. In 2005 or 6, there were Libyan exiles that were prosecuted for trying to raise funds to overthrow the Libyan regime headed by Colonel Gaddafi. And the authorities said, doesn't matter what we think of the Gaddafi regime, how unpalatable or how unpleasant or how much we might oppose it, once you send money to support an organisation or a group of people that are trying to destabilise a foreign power, that's an act of terrorism in the UK, and those men were prosecuted and imprisoned. I think now, after the UK's involvement with NATO in their so-called liberation of Libya, they would have been freed, but they've spent years in prison trying to, as I said, overthrow a repressive regime. So that's how dangerous these laws are. We're not like the United States. I'm not a big fan of the United States, as you can gather. But at least the United States has a Bill of Rights where there are some protections. Those Bill of Rights have been important in trying to at least minimise the impact of Guantanamo Bay. The UK has a Human Rights Act. In Australia, we don't have any of those things. We don't have a Human Rights Act. We have no National Bill of Rights. We've got the Parliament, and the Parliament says you express any radical view, then watch out, because we've got the laws to attack you. My view about these things are that when you're approached by ASIO or AFP, be polite, be courteous, but don't talk to them, because they are not your friends. They are there to compile intelligence, and they are there to prosecute people. They're not there to assist you or the community. Assistance to the community can come through other forms, through proper engagement and dialogue, and through other ways. But once they start speaking to you formally or informally, fireside chat, cup of coffee, we're your friends, the antennas ought to go up and say, something's going on here, we better be careful. All right, where's Baha? Okay. Take a little break if you like, and we can come back with some questions.
Whereas now we're really addressing the issues, so please lend us your ears even more than before, and inshallah will benefit. But just on a special note, something that I forgot to mention before, is that Robert Stowe, when we approached him, we asked him how much it would cost us for this so that we could have the money ready for him. And he said, no, I don't take any money for this because I believe that the Muslim community is being oppressed, so I want to do this for you. So, just so you know, that he's not here as a paid consultant or as a paid lawyer. He's here because he believes in what he's actually doing today, and he's dealing with these problems, and he actually is one of those people who's advocating for us during these times. So, all of you make dua, inshallah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you that, and inshallah, one day we'll be calling our brother in Islam.
Thank you, brother. I might say my children go to Flemington Primary School. It's just opposite the Racecourse Road and Debney Flats, and there are lots of young Somali and other Muslim children there, and it's important for them to have a good understanding of Islam. I know that the school celebrates Eid, and it also celebrates Christmas, and I'm very pleased that it recognises the importance of both of the great religions of the world. I'm surprised people have been listening so well. because the questions that have been asked are really important. And I might just talk generally about the dissemination of information and literature. You might remember in the Nasser Ben Brika case, some of the material that they relied on included what was said to be jihadist videos. That included, for instance, the beheading of people who were taken as hostages. And even though Ben Brika or none of the boys had any involvement with that, any of those organisations, the fact that they had them in their possession, the authorities said, meant that they subscribed to a jihadist ideology. And so it was used against them, despite our attempt to have it excluded, it was used against them. It's not an offence to download material from the internet of a religious nature where you talk about jihad and the importance of jihad. It's not an offence to do that. It becomes an offence if you use it for some other purpose. So if you use it for military purposes or to talk about destabilisation of a government, they can use that as part of the evidence to say that you're involved in some act or preparation of act of terrorism. But you're permitted to download anything. You can go to any website to talk about the importance of jihad. So that's not an offence. Are you obliged to talk to ASIO when they say we'd like to talk to you? What should you say? You should say, look, I've had some advice now. I don't wish to speak to you. Be polite, be cooperative in the sense of don't be obstructive or antagonistic, but just to say, I don't wish to speak to you. I know what my rights are. I don't wish to speak to you. Even if they've made contact in the past, there's no obligation upon you to continue to talk to them. There are a few questions about, for instance, about freedom of speech. Why can't we talk about oppression of Palestinians? Why can't we talk about the crimes that have been committed on them by the Israelis? Why can't we say that that's outrageous and they ought to be brought to account? Why aren't we permitted to say that? Well, you are permitted to say that. There is freedom of speech, but it's limited. It's not it's not unfettered. In other words, you can say what you like so long as you do it within the bounds of the society we live in. You can't incite violence against other people. You can't say that it's legitimate for someone to assassinate the Prime Minister of Australia because they're pro-Israel in their attitude. You'll get into trouble if you say that. So it's not without restriction. You have freedom of speech, but not without restriction. You can't incite violence. You can't incite hatred against any other religion or any other ethnic group. You're not permitted to do that. You can criticise them, but you're not permitted to incite hatred. I'm a strident critic of the State of Israel. I criticise them because of their policies of occupation and repression. I'm critical of the United States for what they've allowed Israel to get away with. But that's not an offence. There's no offence there. I think that the Israeli government should be brought to account, and I think they should be dealt with as war criminals. But that's not an offence. That's an opinion, a legitimate political opinion that I can express. So you can do that. So I'm just going to talk about some of these other questions in some more specific detail. Well, there's a question about the fact that the United States seems to get away with everything in terms of its attack on all minorities, whether it be in Syria or Hezbollah in Lebanon or other organisations. Well, it's true, America's the most powerful country in the world, and we can be critical of them, but they are the ruling country, and we need to be cautious about what we say about the United States. Now, Philip Ruddock, there's a question about Philip Ruddock passing so-called sedition laws, and can they be challenged through the United Nations? Well, Australia is a subscriber, we're a signatory to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So we have freedom of assembly, we have freedom of movement, we have freedom of religion, and these are all principles that we support. And so in the Nasser Ben-Briki case, for instance, we challenged the conditions in which they were detained. We made a complaint to the United Nations. We said Australia was not upholding its obligations in the treatment of unconvicted remand prisoners. And part of that campaign that we took to get them moved from Geelong in the Barwon prison to Melbourne, we utilised the United Nations for that purpose. But it can only really be effective if you've got a federal government who has enough fortitude and willingness to make the complaint, because it normally has to come from the federal government. One of the reasons why I took the opportunity when Baha asked me to speak tonight is that knowledge and information is the most powerful tool you can have. If you know what your rights are, if you know what your obligations are, then you can deal with repression in a much better way. So I'm here tonight to say that the most effective tool to fight repression is one of knowledge. So here's another question about watching videos in Afghanistan. Can you be prosecuted? Would a non-Muslim be prosecuted? Well, I said to you before that I can say things that will never get me prosecuted. I can say that the Israeli government is full of war criminals. No one's going to prosecute me about that. But if other people say it in different contexts, particularly if they're talking about supporting some military attack against Israel, then you're in more trouble. So that's why I say be very cautious. There's a question about if we know that there are people within our group who might be infiltrators or informers, what should we do? Well, Baha will talk to you about that, but maybe those people should be exposed. We talked about immunity under an ASIO investigation. I said to you, under the ASIO Act, whatever you say in the interrogation cannot be used as evidence against you in some other prosecution. So when you are forcibly interrogated by ASIO, if they have a warrant, what can happen? You might say anything about what your intentions are, about what you support, about what organisation you think's doing a good job. You could talk about providing financial support to Hezbollah or to Hamas or whoever, and you cannot be prosecuted from what you say. You have an indemnity against prosecution. What you don't have an indemnity against is if you say something that's untruthful, and it's able to be proved to be untruthful, then you can be prosecuted. But ASIO's main role is gathering intelligence. What they do with the intelligence is another question. I'm suspicious of them. I don't trust them when they say that they don't give it to any other agency. We know that they do, and they have power to cooperate with other agencies. So, but what you say technically, if you were prosecuted at some other point, and for instance they tried to say, didn't you say when you were interrogated by ASIO at their headquarters that you support Al-Qaeda, that question could not be asked of you and your answer could not be given, so it could not be used. There's a question about warrants. When police or ASIO come to your house, are you entitled to look at the warrant? Yes, you are. You can request a copy of the warrant. So a warrant, for instance, under ASIO, can be good for a period of time, 30 days or something of that nature. I can't remember the specific amount of time, but over a long period of time. So a warrant is not just for one day to attend premises. It usually enables the ASIO agents to attend over a period of time, but usually just once. You can ask for a copy of the warrant, you can ask to see the warrant. If they say they don't have the warrant, then don't let them in. They must have a warrant to enter your premises. The only other way either the Australian Federal Police or ASIO can get into your premises if you invite them in there. So what often happens is they knock on the door, mother or father answers the door. We just want to ask questions of your son or your daughter. Can we come into the premises? The natural reaction is to allow people to come in. That's the natural reaction. You don't have anything to hide, you don't have anything to fear. So it's a difficult thing to say to the police or to the agents, I refuse you permission to enter the premises unless you have a warrant, because it goes against how a person might respond naturally. Particularly you haven't got anything to hide or you haven't done anything wrong. But remember, under ASIO warrant, they can collect information that doesn't have to relate necessarily to a terrorist attack. They can collect information about fundraising, for instance, fundraising by other people. You might have information stored on your computer. So once they've got the warrant, you must let them in. You can't resist them because you'll be charged with a separate offence. There's a question asked about the problems that are often encountered at airports. What happens if a customs officer says, I want to check your luggage, I want to check your wallet, I want to check your phone, I want to ask you where you've been, who you've seen, how long you're away for, questions of that nature. Ordinarily, they can only conduct a search if they've got a reasonable suspicion that you've been involved in some wrongdoing. Having been bought drugs into the country, having brought money into the country illegally, other contraband illegally. They have to have a reasonable suspicion that you've done something wrong. They can conduct random searches for drugs, and we know that through sniffer dogs and things of that nature. Are you obliged to say anything? They'll always say to you, you are not obliged to say or do anything, but anything you say or do may be used in evidence against you. So you can say to them, thank you for that. I don't wish to say anything until I've had legal advice. Now, what you want to avoid is confrontation. You want to avoid being detained at an airport unnecessarily. So you've always got to use your discretion about how much you say and what you might say to them. And again, it's important to try and avoid confrontation, because it's an easy thing to be charged with hindering or obstructing an agent or a police officer in the execution of their duty. Very easy thing to be charged with, and then you have the whole drama of a court case. So you've got to be careful about the way you use your discretion. If you think they're going to download information from your phone, then you ask them under what power or authority that they have to download information. They would not ordinarily be able to do it without your permission. So it's important to be firm about these things, to challenge them in a careful way, asking them what power they might have to go through information in your wallet or your phone. Under what power are they trying to do that? Once they're challenged, they usually back off, because often they will just say, while there's no resistance by you, I'll go through your wallet, tell me who these people are, who are their names on these cards, where did he get this money from, they'll continue to push the boundaries. As soon as you what authority you're doing this, they'll back away. They'll need you. They'll continue to push the boundaries whilst you are not resisting. There's a question here. Do you believe it will be illegal to be a Muslim in Australia in the future? Well, not while I'm alive. I believe people have a right to choose their religion and practice their religion in any way they wish. And there are many of my friends and colleagues who support that as a fundamental human right. So I don't think that will ever occur. And if we got anywhere near close to it, it would be a very sad day. I'll be emigrating myself, I think. You are allowed to copy any, there's a question again about information and dissemination of information. Are you allowed to copy rulings on jihad? Is it possible to disseminate that information to other people, pass it on to them? Of course it is. So long as the information, as I said, doesn't show that you're going to be involved in some other activity against the state. There's a question about what should you say to an ASIO officer when they say to you, we'd like to question you or talk to you. The question is here, can I say no comment because they have no warrant in hand? How do I overcome such a situation? You should just simply say, I've had some advice and I don't wish to say anything, and just walk away. They can't detain you, they can't hold you, and as I said, you can decline to answer any questions. If they've got a warrant and they say, we've got a warrant for your detention and interrogation, ask for a copy of a warrant or a minimum to view the warrant, to see the warrant firsthand. If they do have a warrant, you should go with the agent or with a police officer peacefully. You should never resist arrest. There's a question, if you are formally interrogated by ASIO, what questions can you reject? Can you refuse to meet them? You can refuse to meet them if they don't have a warrant. As I said, there's no such thing as an informal chat or having coffee or anything of that nature, because every contact you have with them will be recorded. So you don't have to answer any questions in that context. You don't have to go and meet with any ASIO agent or police officer. You can say, I know my rights, I don't wish to go with you. The only time, again I'm going to repeat this, that you're required to go with them is if they have a warrant. What happens when they keep calling, and I know this happens a lot, they keep pestering you until you finally relinquish and say, okay, I'll come and talk to you. You don't have to talk to them, and even if they keep saying, keep ringing, I just want to ask you some questions. I'm not worried about you, I don't think you've done anything wrong, I just want to ask you about your next door neighbour Mohammed. Then you do not have to answer any questions. And they're persistent. Let me tell you this, they are persistent. They will keep asking you questions, but you need to be assertive and say, I've had advice, I do not wish to answer any questions. Here's a question about why is it that Muhammad Hanif got compensation and the other brothers didn't. Very good question. Muhammad Hanif, there was no basis on which he could possibly have been charged. So he never got to the first hurdle. He was detained unlawfully, and there was absolutely no basis on which he could have ever been charged. He got what was called an ex gratia payment. In other words, it was simply an agreement by the state to pay him. The other brothers, we said, should have been compensated. The brothers who were acquitted, they should have been compensated for what had occurred, but there is no power for the state, there's no obligation on the state to compensate any person, terrorism or any other criminal offence, if they get acquitted of a charge. And I think that's something that we're obviously trying to change, because you take 3 years out of a person's life, you subject them to the circumstances of detention in which they were subjected. They should be compensated. That's going to take government to show some courage, to show, well, when a wrong has been committed against a person, they should be entitled to be compensated for that wrong. That's not going to happen, I don't think, in the foreseeable future. Here's another question about whether particular websites that you might look to, whether they are likely to be monitored. There's no question that some websites are flagged. So if you go to a particular website, there will be monitoring of you if it shows the most serious form of military jihad or execution of people, hostages and the like. It's probable that some of those websites are going to be flagged, and they'll know if you're accessing them. It's not illegal necessarily to go to those websites, but as I said, ASIO is about compiling intelligence on people. If they say, how come this person has gone to that website supporting Al-Qaeda, how come they've gone to it 20 times in the last month? That's occurring, then you'll expect a knock on the door. There's a question precisely on this issue. ASIO have been telling me things such as it's not an offence to have an Al-Qaeda material like Inspire magazine in your possession. I feel they're baiting me, and would you like your opinion on that, please? It's not an offence to have literature in your possession. It becomes, as I said, an offence only if you use the literature for some other purpose. And so, again, the Benbrika case is the best example of this. They had extremist jihadists films in their possession, and the prosecutor said to the jury, why would you have these videos in your possession unless you're intending to do something, unless you're intending to attack some institution? And they used it in that way. Now, we said this, the videos that they had were the beheading videos, and we said that they were so prejudicial. As soon as any person from the jury saw them, the execution of someone, they would be horrified, and they were horrified when it was shown to them. And so they can be damaging if you are prosecuted. But that wasn't the only evidence they relied on. They relied on a whole range of other evidence. And by itself it was not enough to convict them, but in conjunction with other evidence about telephone intercepts, about what they thought and what they thought that they might do, was the basis on which they were convicted. We talked about engagement and dialogue between government agencies and the Muslim community, which is a good thing. And there's a question about if some organisations do meet with ASIO or FBI or other intelligence communities, what does that mean about the organisation? I don't think you could say that means they're working with them, but I'd be very careful about, I'd only be talking about the football and the cricket when I was having a barbecue with them. I wouldn't be talking about anything else. So of itself you couldn't say that they're working with those organisations, but I do think it's important that we're all part of the one broader, bigger community It's very important, as I said, from my own perspective, and I do this with my own children, that they should have a very good understanding of Islam and what it means, what it truly means, rather than what some people in the West say it means. There's some more questions about freedom of speech, which is obviously a great concern to people. And as I said before, you do have freedom of speech, but you need to be careful how you exercise it. You're permitted to voice your opposition to things that the government might do in its foreign policy, its military policy. As I said to you, I'm a strident opponent of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. I think we've gone back in the last 10 years, we've achieved nothing, we've wasted this is completely secondary. We've wasted millions of lives, millions of dollars, but we've caused untold misery on the killing of innocent civilians. And I think history will judge us badly for our involvement in that conflict. And I know that not all Australians are happy. In fact, the majority, every opinion poll says that the majority of Australians oppose intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. For some reason, both major political parties think that it's a good thing to be involved in. Is it possible to talk about those things? Yes, it is, and you should talk about it, and we should have a robust debate in the community. And that's one reason, in a sense, why I'm here tonight. I reckon we should say if it's wrong, and we should be entitled to express that view. There's an enormous advancement in technology in the last 10 years. The capacity to monitor what people say on their phones is stronger than it's ever been. So there are often telephone intercepts that you'll have no idea are taking place. Some people say, I think my phone's been monitored. How can I tell? You can't tell. There's no click, there's nothing else. I'm just saying to you, you be cautious. Funnily enough, when we said that to other people who were charged with terrorism offences, the authorities said that we were teaching them how to conduct counter-surveillance techniques. I've answered a question about warrants. Don't let police or AFP agents in if they don't have a warrant. There's a question about can we have conversation with AFP and ASIO where it doesn't involve some obvious operation that might involve an attack on shopping centres, etc. I'm just cautious generally about having conversations with AFP and with ASIO. They want to speak to you for a purpose. You might think it's meaningless or innocuous. In other words, there's nothing serious about it. But then they're only going to talk to you for a reason, and the reason is to compile intelligence. And so that's their job. That's what their charter says. They're there to accrue intelligence. Can you get into trouble if you contribute to the mosque financially? I've got that question right. Of course not. You're entitled to make financial contribution to your community organisations, your religious organisations, cultural. So that's certainly not an offence, and particularly if we just talk about the Preston Mosque, it's regarded obviously as one of the most important religious institutions in the state. Catholic, Protestant, doesn't matter. It's regarded as a very important institution. So it's certainly no offence. There's a question about going to Facebook sites that talk about repression of people within the Muslim communities in the Middle East. There's no offence to access any of those sites. Again, it depends on whether they, in the eyes of the AFP or ASIO, are regarded as extremist sites. You need to be cautious because they can track those people who do access those sites. There's a question about the Somali boys. I do want to say something about that because the person that went to Holsworthy Army Barracks is someone that's known to many people here within the Preston Mosque. And he talked to the other boys about how easy it would be to breach security there but it's important to remember that there was no specific plan, there was no attack that was going to take place. They just talked about how easy it would be to achieve. Nobody had any weapons on them. Sure, bad things were said over the phone, but nothing was ever going to happen. And Sam Fatal, who was arrested in jail awaiting to be deported, so he could never have done anything, said to be central to the plot. The allegation that something was going to occur could never have taken place. That's why I'm so upset about that conviction, because the conviction doesn't have to rely on a specific act taking place. It can be a conspiracy, which means an agreement to commit some sort of act in preparation of a terrorist attack. Means that them talking together about doing something against the Holsworthy Army Barracks. Well, not only did not happen, it could never have happened. But it's still a crime according to Australian counter-terrorism law, and they're going to be punished for it, and they will go to jail, I expect, for some years. Here's a person wants to know whether they can involve themselves in the campaign against the boycott Israel trade sanctions. We're acting for all of those people who are charged with boycotting Max Brenner stores, the chocolate organisation that has links with the Israeli army. Nearly all of them are students. Can you get into trouble if you support them? Well, you shouldn't get into trouble if you support them, and my view is that they're legitimately entitled to peacefully protest, and that's what they've done against Max Brenner and what they're on about. We're entitled to say, here's a company that we don't agree with their involvement with the Israeli army. We think that if there's going to be any justice in Palestine, then Israel investment should be boycotted. So my view is that you can become involved in it. Your risk is, if you do become involved in it, like lots of the students that have been, they're going to get charged. Here's a person says that they get a bit anxious when they're on the phone, and they let their emotions run away with them because they want to talk about the injustices that have occurred, can they get into trouble? You can if you say things that incite violence or hatred, but you're allowed to say that it's a complete outrage, as I've said, that Jack Thomas was ever charged and spent any time in custody, or the Tamil people were ever charged with providing humanitarian relief to their community. So you're entitled to say those things, but again, it's all a question of making sure that you don't overstep the mark. One thing that we've had a debate about in this country in the last couple of years is whether torture can ever be justified. There are some people who say, well, you're permitted to engage in torture like they did in Guantanamo Bay for Khalid, what's his name, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, is it? Waterboarding and things of that nature, because they wanted to prevent further terrorist attack. And so, is it legitimate for any of those intelligence or policing agencies to engage in torture? Well, it's specifically prohibited and it's illegal in this country, and there's a strong view that it should be and should remain so. The short answer to that question is no. You can never justify torture to extract information. Here's a question about how governments have enormous resources. Why can't they go and defeat Al-Qaeda, the Taliban and Al-Shabaab instead of harassing Muslims? Well, the problem you've got, as we said about the death of Osama bin Laden, it's madness to think that if you take one person out, that you'll break the organisation if the organisation has a groundswell of public support. And it's true of every organisation if it's popularly supported. It's true of what's happened in Iraq. Doesn't matter how many people they try and eliminate. People don't support them, then there's another one to take their place. I think that just about covers it. I'm happy to wait around after we're finished if anyone's got any more questions. So thanks very much for having me tonight.
Rob, can you just elaborate a little bit more on the materials? You said before that having materials is not a crime in itself. However, people being charged with possession of something.
Yeah.
So how does that work in?
It's true. You can be charged with an offence called possession of a thing. That's what the offence is called, possession of a thing. What's a thing? Is it literature? Is it a video? Is it CD? Is it military equipment? Is it chemical glassware? Any of that can amount to possession of a thing, but it's got to be used for some terrorist purpose. So that's the key to it, for the fostering or nurturing for the commission of a terrorist attack. So, as in the Benbrika case, it's not enough simply to have the material in your possession. You've got to have it for some other purpose. And so there's a real debate. There are those people who believe in freedom of thought, say, well, you should be permitted to read and see anything. The community says there's got to be limitations on what you can see. You can't look at pornography, for instance, or certain forms of pornography. You can't look at material that inspires racial vilification or hatred. So there are limits on what you can view. But it seems to me politically you can view other things that you might support, for instance, Kashmiri independence. Are you permitted to look at videos that talk about Kashmiri independence? I think you can. The area is not black and white. There are areas of grey. So you just need to be cautious. The more it might said to be offensive to the community, that involves, for instance, depiction of the killing of innocents or the bombing of military targets or whatever it might be, then that might cause more trouble.
Today. So we thank Robert Starry for his presentation today, and as he said, he's happy to stick around a little bit for those of you that want to have a bit of a one-on-one with him.